Hi y'all, welcome to my shop. Today I want to talk about why some people think tenons are a great way to hold your wood turning project on with your 4-jaw scroll chuck. Holding a project with a tenon, or what some folks outside the USA might call a spigot, is a great way to turn a wide variety of wood turning projects. Richard Raffet even says he never uses a recess for a bowl if he can possibly avoid it. It's easier to shape a foot appropriate to a bowl when you're using a tenon because you can change the shape of it afterwards. You can start off with a very large tenon appropriate to support that particular project, and then turn it down later. You can actually have the tenon become part of the bowl itself. Now let's start with some problem solving. Why do your turning blanks fly off the lathe? Some of y'all might have had some experience about that. If so, you might want to leave a comment below. But generally the biggest reason is because you haven't shaped the tenon to appropriately match the chuck jaws that you're using. Perhaps you didn't allow the tenon to be long enough. Perhaps you allowed it to bottom out in the bottom of the chuck. Perhaps you didn't continue to tighten it if it's green wood, and as it dries out and compresses it can work its way loose. Perhaps you were cutting too deep a cut if you're doing a hollow form. Perhaps you weren't riding the bevel on the inside of the bowl, and as a result you were doing too much lateral scraping pressure for that tenon to support it. So now let's look at some tenon details that will help you when you're making your next tenon. Alright, let's look at some tenon details. Okay, first tenon we want to talk about, and this is very important, so y'all please pay strict attention to this because this gets a lot of people in trouble. Pay special attention to making a tenon shape that matches your jaw profile. That's either going to be dovetail or parallel depending on the chuck jaw design. So here's an example of parallel. And basically we're just going to have a tenon that's got a 90-degree shoulder, and the walls of the tenon, or spigot if you're outside the USA, this angle right here has got to be 90 degrees. These walls have to be parallel. That's important for a large number of chuck jaws, including the jaws that come with the older Technitool or Nova 50mm jaws. They now come out with a newer profile that is dovetailed, but to parallel. It's also what you need for record power standard jaws, Sorby Patriot chuck standard jaws, one-way stronghold and talon chucks for their number 2 profile jaw tenons. They also call for a parallel tenon. When it comes to those jaw sets, a lot of folks believe because of the profile, and I'll show a picture here of what that normal jaws look like. It has what they call a lip, or what some people might call a micro dovetail that bites into the wood. But you need to make that tenon parallel. You may find somebody that tells you different. I'm a big believer in always advocating understanding and following a manufacturer's instructions until I have enough information or enough experience and knowledge to know when to deviate. I have not found a need to deviate from parallel tenon, because if you wind up cutting a tiny little micro notch in here, for example, you're going to wind up weakening that hole in most instances, and it doesn't get you anything. Now here's what comes from the manual for the Nova G3 chuck with their standard jaws. Other Technitool documentation is similar to these jaws. Make a spigot as parallel as possible to maximize the efficiency of the clamping action. The 50mm 2-inch standard jaw has a thin lip or shoulder at the front of the face, which is designed to bite into the timber as the jaws are tightened. And then they have in capital letters, "Do not cut a recess, as this will reduce the gripping power." Now I've heard of some turners that insist you cut a small dovetail with the point of a skew because of this lip. But the manufacturer says no. I agree with the manufacturer in this case. You may want to watch my review of the Record Power chuck, which has I'll link above here, which has identical standard jaws to the Technitool older jaws. But now they have a new design with their ProTech chuck, which is newly designed and improved according to them, which makes it a Dovetail according to most of the other, similar to what most of the other chuck manufacturers use. But in any case, you may want to watch this review of that record power chuck which has identical jaws, where I describe and illustrate the gripping. By the way, I'm not a big fan of the standard number 2 one-way profile jaws that have serrations. My experience has been that these jaws have a tendency to have a serration bite in on at the bottom of one part of the tenon and push it forward a little bit, creating a tiny gap which reduces the effectiveness of the hole and tends to cause vibration when you're turning. You may disagree. If so, leave your comments below and explain why. As I've said before, my way is not the only way, may not be the best way, but it's the way that I've developed over a period of time doing based on experience and a lot of research on how other folks do it. So now let's look at Dovetail. The Dovetail, and this is the piece of wood, comes in slightly like this. And let me change colors on the chuck so you can kind of show that the chuck jaws in this description are not locked in yet, but there's the bottom, there's the chuck jaw, and the Dovetail shape of the tenon should roughly approximate the Dovetail jaws. And the gap that'll close down a little bit when you tighten it. Now, it's important to look at your manufacturer to find out what is that angle right here. Generally, a good number is going to be 10 degrees. Your chuck jaws may vary, and I'll go into some examples here in just a moment. But let me show you what happens if you wind up getting this too steep. Now, it doesn't have to be perfect, it just has to be close. But you'd rather have it not excessively acute like this. This is going to be more than 10 degrees. And that will tend to get you in trouble because the chuck jaws that are going to be at closer to 10 degrees. I didn't draw this perfectly, and this Dovetail should end short of the bottom. It should not bottom out. Okay. The problem is that if you make it too acute an angle on your Dovetail, you're only going to wind up squeezing it at the very bottom, and you're going to have this gap that could cause some vibration and cause it to work loose. So let's go through the process of making a chuck tenon on a bowl blank. I'm going to mark the tenon, and I'm designing this for my 50 millimeter standard jaws with a parallel face, but I'll show you we may wind up converting it to a Dovetail. Alright, so first thing we're going to do is mark it. Make it a bit oversized when you turn in green wood because it's going to shrink as it dries and turn oval, and you'll have to true it up later. I'm going to switch to or use a 40/40 grind bowl gouge on this. There's some wood out here. Alright, now I'm going to roll this over a little bit past maybe 9:30. Going to come in straight in and then pull it out. Straight in and pull it out because I want a really nice flat shoulder at 90 degrees here. If anything, maybe a slight concave in there. Now that corner needs to be very crisp at 90 degrees. Even with a 40/40, I find that to be a bit of a challenge. Some of y'all may be successful at that. So I switched to a Dovetail 3/8 inch Dovetail spindle gouge, which has very shallow flute, gives it a lot of strength when you're applying it to a bowl like this. And then I'm just going to follow that parallel down. And go straight in until I know I've got just a little bit extra. I'm going to come back here and clean it up a little bit. And it's not quite parallel, so I'm going to come back, take another pass. And I'm looking down the side. I'm looking up here for that profile. And bring it out. So you can see this has is 90 degrees for my normal jaws that call for a parallel tenon. And then I'm actually going to kind of just nip a little chamfer here on the edge with either a bowl gouge or the spindle gouge. If it does come off, it's less likely to shear the tenon by having that little bit of a bevel chamfer right there. Now, if we were making a dovetail, like I suggest for most jaws, a 10-degree angle or 80 degree, depending on which way you measure it, would be fine. And I'm going to, again, do that with my detail gouge because I find this easier to make this kind of cut than it is with a bowl gouge. Now, let's see how close I came. Now, you can measure that, but it's somewhat awkward to do this. You can simply make you a little, take you a thin piece of plywood or hardwood and measure off an 80-degree angle, and you can check it, and that's pretty close to the money. If you want to spend the money or you happen to have one, you can always use this little Nova jig, if I can figure out how to use it, like this. In this case, I'm going to look down to see if this one is parallel with this one, and it is, because it's set for, again, 10 degrees is generally pretty standard. Now, dovetails will vary, so don't take 10 degrees to the bank. Read, if you're using a dovetail, read what your manufacturer says, because I've seen them vary from anywhere to I think 75 degrees to about 82 degrees, so they can vary. Also, remember to always, on your bowl blanks, to leave a tiny little dimple there when you're going to return the bowl later, a twice turn bowl, to allow you to center this bowl for truing everything up. You can determine how good a fit you got on any chuck tenon by determining if you can slide a piece of paper in there between the face of the jaws and the wood. If you can, then you don't have a good fit. Okay, let's talk about the size of a tenon. General rule of thumb is the diameter of your tenon ought to be about a third the size of your bowl. So in this case, this one's 3.5 inches. That would support a bowl of more than 10 inches, and this is only 8 inches, so it's plenty big, plenty strong. This bowl I just made, we've got a 2-inch tenon, so that would support about a 6-inch bowl, and that's about what I've got. So that's a reasonable size diameter for a 6-inch bowl. Now let's talk about the depth. The depth, this is what I'm talking about, the depth of the tenon. It should never bottom out in your chuck, so that distance has got to be less than either the bottom of your chuck or the tenon, depending on the profile. Now in this case, for these 75 millimeter bowl jaws, I should not make a tenon, a dovetail tenon, larger than much more than 1/4 of an inch or about 6 millimeter. Otherwise, it's going to start creeping into getting bumped by this serrated edge and causing some push out, which will tend to cause some vibration, or you'll be able to stick a piece of paper between the jaws and the bowl. Now, if we look at these two larger sets of jaws, now in this case, this one, it would need to be less than 1/2 of an inch, say 7/16 of an inch, so it doesn't bottom out. This one is approximately the same size. I mentioned the dovetail angle generally should be about 10 degrees. I want to point out that on my 5-inch record power jaws, that angle is actually a 15-degree angle. for holding very, very large projects and really locking it in, like large platters or even a tabletop. On the power grip jaws, they call it something different, but that's what Nova calls the Technical calls their similar set of jaws. The angle is only 10 degrees, so this one is much steeper than this one. And with the bowl jaws, I just finished using, the angle is 78 degrees. So again, read your chuck jaw specifications or measure that angle to get it right, because you want to approximate that angle. 10 degrees should generally handle most anything. I'd probably want to, for this one where it's 15 degrees, I'd probably want to make it a little bit steeper than 10 degrees. You know, maybe 12, 13. Wouldn't have to be as much as 15, and you certainly don't want it more than 16, and you get into that position we talked about before where it only grabs at the bottom. Now, we've been talking about tenons mostly for cross grain or bowl turning, but you know, it also applies to any number of spindle-oriented projects, whether it's a goblet or a vase or a box or an ornament. The tool that I generally use for something like this is this 8mm beading and parting tool. Now we know if I'm going to use, well, let me just show you how it works. I would not use a bowl gouge because you're taking a peeling cut, and this is just a much easier tool to use. Now an alternative to that, of course, is a skew on its side, taking a peeling cut, and we'll start off with that. Now, the main thing I want to point out is, I may have pointed out before, you want absolutely clean 90-degree shoulder between the face of the chuck jaws and and where it's going to clamp, and very clean in there, very nice 90-degree corner, and that would have it. Now that's a parallel set of jaws. Now if I wanted to make a dovetail set of jaws, I would just slightly incline this just a little bit after I turned it that way, and then we almost have a dovetail. And again, I would probably just kind of knock off that corner there, and there we go. Now, if I was using this tool, I would use it exactly the same way as a skew. Now, what I would not want to use, but depends on what tools that you have available, you could make do. If you were using a thinner parting tool than your tenon, you're going to have to make several cuts and then kind of clean them up, and I tend to find that to be a bit fussier. If you have a 1/4 inch parting tool, it's actually easier, but the 1/8 tends to be, I found to be more of a challenge for novice turners in my workshops. Now this is a 3/16. This is not too bad. This is an improvement in that you might have to only make 2 passes and kind of clean it up a little bit. I think it worthwhile to also note on both the skew and the beading and parting tool that you actually have not 2 bevels to sharpen, but 4, because you want to get the sides kind of honed a little bit, not on the grinder, but just with a hone. And that's because as you come in here and you incline this just a little bit, where this is going to be the leading edge, this is actually going to do some cutting on the face. Let me illustrate that. And I think you can see the shavings come off on that side. Perhaps you're making a vase or a hollow form out of a log or a large spindle orientation in which you're going to turn a spigot. Sometimes that tenon is going to be longer than usual, and let me show you what that might look like. So mounting that log, I would make a parallel tenon, because as you see, if you hold a ruler down here, the tops of the serrated edges and the top of the dovetail are all parallel. And that gives you a fairly nice hole. Let me show you. Certainly on a log like this, I would want to go ahead and rough it out with tailstock support as long as possible before I started hollowing. But with that very long tenon, in this case a full 1 1/8 inch, you've got a lot for it to grab on this spigot. And there's several jaws that use this same type of technique. Serrations and a parallel tenon. The long tenons on spindle-oriented projects works very well for these jaws that are fairly deep, have serrations that will really grip the wood besides the ones I just showed you. And that also includes, Nova's got some what they call spigot jaws, 35 and 45 millimeter, that in this case they only have serrated edges that really grip on it. And those are intended to use on projects such as this, where you're extending out a ways from the chuck, 6 or more inches maybe, and you want a really tight grip. So whether it's goblets or chalices or perhaps hollow forms. Some folks would prefer to use a faceplate for that work. I wouldn't argue that faceplate wouldn't do very well. I just find jaws where a scroll chuck where you have the right jaw set just makes things faster and easier than a faceplate. If you enjoyed this video, you might enjoy this one you may or may not have seen before. I plan to do a future video on chuck recess, and I appreciate you leaving any comments below as to what particular tip you picked up out of this video. Y'all stay safe. Come on back here.